Can you hear me? It's good to see everyone. Welcome. Dean Robinson, Professor Davis, dear colleagues, our amazing students, distinguished guests from New Haven and beyond, good afternoon. My name is Cajetan Iheka. I'm the director of the Whitney Humanities Center, the host of the Tanner Lectures on Human Values. I have the easiest job this evening, easier than my colleague, Professor Caleb Smith, who is introducing the extraordinary Professor Davis. And of course, easier than Professor Davis, whose lectures provide the occasion for our gathering. I stand before you to do three things: to welcome you, provide an overview of the Tanner Lectures, and to briefly introduce the Professor Smith. So first, welcome. That's easy, right? On behalf of my colleagues, I want to welcome you to this lecture. We're glad that you're here, and we hope you'll visit our website and return for other events. Please note that tomorrow's lecture will be in the same space at 4:30. Let me now say a few words about the Tanner Lectures on Human Values, which were established by the American scholar, industrialist, and philanthropist, Robert Clark Tanner, and his wife, Grace Tanner. Educated at the University of Utah and Stanford, Robert Tanner went on to become a New Testament scholar and professor at the University of Utah. Well, that is not the whole story. While still an undergraduate, he founded a jewelry company. His company, O.C. Tanner, which manufactures employee recognition awards, became an extraordinary success. This highly successful enterprise underwrites the Tanner's philanthropy. These efforts include the Tanner Lectures here and at a number of other universities in the US, United Kingdom, and beyond. The Tanners also funded philosophy rooms and libraries at several universities. They were passionate about the exchange of ideas and the sacred place of the university in upholding that ideal. In O.C. Tanner's words, and I quote, "The university is absolutely the greatest creation of human existence. It has the greatest promise, the greatest help, the greatest meaning for finding what is true and what is valuable," close quote. Mr. Tanner was right then. He is still right now. We cannot afford to compromise the fundamental promise of the university. Not now, not ever. Appointment as a Tanner lecturer is a recognition of the uncommon achievement and outstanding ability in the field of human values. The lecturers come from many walks of life, and these lectures are designed to be international and intercultural and are meant to transcend ethnic, national, religious, and ideological distinctions. Previous lecturers on our campus include Dipesh Chakrabarti, Rob Nixon, Achille Mbembe, Judith Butler, Salman Rushdie, Anthony Grafton, and Paul Gilroy. We are delighted to add Professor Davis to this accomplished roster. Professor Davis's commitment to human values in their broadest applications, especially to the disenfranchised and marginalized, including the incarcerated, makes her an ideal Tanner lecturer. In selecting incarceration as this year's theme, in what seems like a lifetime ago, I was struck by the rare transcendence of ideological divide on this issue, to a great extent at least. The left and right may have different solutions to the problem, but there's a sort of agreement on the injustice of the incarceration system. The country and its politicians were and remain divided, but the unjustness, the inhuman structure of the system was one thing that both sides could agree on. I was also motivated by the extraordinary talent and field-leading research and service that colleagues were doing on the subject across campus, including the admirable work of the Yale Prison Education Initiative. The director of that program, Zelda Rowland, alongside Professor Smith, Elizabeth Hinthin, and Rod Ferguson, provided guidance on selecting the speaker for this occasion. I thank them for their advice and transformative work in this field. Please join me in thanking them. You can learn about the prison initiative and related projects by browsing a copy of the zine produced to commemorate these lectures by two of our brilliant and creative students, Emily Theos and John Mollett. I am grateful to them for their beautiful invention and to my colleagues at the center for the hard work they've done to organize this event. They are Diane, Ashley, Inessa, Megan, and Sandra. And to Nathaniel and Mark and student workers helping out today. Please, let's give them a round of applause. My final thanks go to Metal, Jamie, and their team in the Champlin's office for the gift of this wonderful space and for saving me. We had scheduled this in a smaller room, and it became so clear that I was going to make so many enemies if we didn't move this. So I thank Metal for making it possible for us to be here. As we begin, I remind you that the university is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. Interfering with the speaker's ability to speak and the audience's ability to hear is not consistent with this university's free expression policy. Thankfully, Professor Davis has agreed to answer some questions. Please hold our questions until the end. I urge you to be concise and pose your question in 1 minute or less. While I would love to take every question and comment, our gift of time is limited. I apologize in advance and seek your grace for the fact that we can only take a few. Thanks for your cooperation. Now it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Caleb Smith, Professor of American Literature and Culture in the Department of English and incoming chair of the department. Professor Smith is the author of several books and articles, including The Prison and American Imagination. He also authenticated and edited Austin Reed's 1858 manuscript, The Life and Adventures of a Haunted Convict, the first known prison memoir by an African-American writer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Smith to the podium.
Hi, we're doing this. As Cajetan said, I'm a faculty member in English and American Studies here at Yale. As a scholar and a critic, I've spent much of my career studying the cultural history of disciplinary institutions. I'm also an instructor and a member of the faculty board of the Yale Prison Education Initiative, a program offering Yale courses in 2 correctional facilities here in Connecticut, and a college degree program in partnership with the University of New Haven. Some of our staff, faculty, and alumni are here today, and I take a moment to acknowledge them. We're very grateful for this opportunity to work with the Whitney Humanities Center, and we acknowledge the vision of the director, Cajetan Iheka, in making this event happen. At a time when our universities and schools are under so much political pressure, we're glad to have this opportunity to raise some questions about the priorities that divest from education while investing more and more in punishment and incarceration. It's one of the great honors of my life to stand up here and introduce the legendary Angela Davis. We're gathered here in a chapel, but we're hosted by a humanities center dedicated to the study of ideas, culture, and history. We're assembled for the Tanner Lectures in Human Values, so we might take this occasion to ask, what can the humanities do, and what difference can our values make? Angela Davis is an incandescent answer to these questions. For decades, Professor Davis has been both a leading thinker about incarceration in America and a guiding light in movements for justice and freedom. Her work on the page and in the streets shows us how theory and practice, critique and activism can complement each other. Our ideas guide our actions as we try to make a difference in the world, but the world keeps pushing back, challenging us to reconsider our ideas, and so the work continues. What can the humanities do? Some scholars devote their research to making discoveries, unearthing forgotten histories or recovering neglected experiences. Professor Davis has made significant contributions of this kind. In her classic 1971 essay, The Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves, she changed the conversation about slavery's history by focusing on Black women's informal labor and everyday resistance. Seemingly trivial forms, she called them, but full of meaning for those who care to pay attention. What can a thinker in the humanities hope to achieve? Some of us set out to make new conceptual connections or craft new interpretations. In her 1981 book, Women, Race, and Class, Professor Davis insisted that these three social forces, gender, race, and class, cannot be fully understood in isolation. It is necessary to see them together, interlocking. In Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, Professor Davis went on to show how a great musical tradition was itself a resource for theoretical and political work. What can an intellectual hope to create? There are a few of us humanists who would like to think of our own writing as a craft, maybe even as a kind of literature. Angela Davis's autobiography has become a canonical book, not so much a commentary as a primary text in its own right, with a little help from a great editor by the name of Toni Morrison. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor put it in a recent piece for the New York Review of Books, in writing about her own experiences, Davis captures why so many of her peers became radicalized. Angela Davis has made major contributions to the analysis of American history, culture, and politics. She's written books that continue to be studied and to inspire. But she's also achieved something even rarer. She has fostered a new kind of hope. A hope that, without her, many of us might not have known how to name or even to imagine. As early as 1993, while mass incarceration as we know it was continuing its rapid expansion across the landscape, she asked the startling, disorienting questions. Are prisons obsolete? Just when incarceration was cementing itself with all the weight of an inevitability, Davis and her allies in the organization known as Critical Resistance had the courage to say that its time might be coming to an end. The hope that Angela Davis helped to kindle in our minds is named in the title of her lectures here, Abolition. It is an invitation to envision the end of the prison system. It's also a creative act, a new beginning in theory and practice alike. Please join me in welcoming Angela Davis to this stage.
Well, good afternoon. And thank you so much, Professor Caleb Smith, for the wonderful introduction. And let me thank the Tanner Committee, the Whitney Humanities Center and its director, Cajetan Iheka, and Deputy Director, Diane Barrett-Brown, and the Whitney staff and executive committee. And I would especially like to thank Professor Rod Ferguson for first sending me this invitation and for all of the work that you've done over the years. And let me also acknowledge the some 900 faculty on this campus who recently signed a letter to the president and provost calling upon them to legally challenge the, quote, unlawful demands that threaten academic freedom and university self-governance, and calling upon them to not to succumb to political threats. Yes. And also, the letter asked the university to furnish legal assistance to students whose free speech rights have been violated. So thank you, Yale faculty. And also thank you, Yaleys, for Palestine. In 2006, and oh, by the way, I've spoken here before, so I'm remembering as I look around. I spoke in this chapel in 1984, some 40 years ago, right? Okay, let me begin. I'm taking us back to 2006. In 2006, in the small town of Jena, Louisiana, a Black student on the local high school campus inquired of the principal whether he was allowed to sit under a tree where white students ordinarily sat. As the story unfolded, he and his friends did sit in that spot. But the next morning, nooses appeared on the tree. A number of incidents happened in response, including an altercation during which a white student was injured. And this led to the arrest of 6 Black students, 5 of whom were charged with attempted murder. Thousands of students and other protesters traveled to the town of Jena for a rally in support of Black high school students who once again had become the target of unequivocal racism, old-style Southern white supremacy. The jazz musician, Christian Scott Atunde Adjua, I don't know if any of you know his work. If you haven't, you should check it out. He was one of a number of artists who composed pieces memorializing these events. His song was called Genocide, Genacide. By 2025, some 2 decades later, when a Palestinian graduate student at Columbia University, one of the most visible student activists on the campus protesting the ongoing war on Gaza and the genocide by the state of Israel. When this student was abducted by immigration's customs enforcement and transferred to its central Louisiana detention facility, by that time, US government expenditures for privatized incarceration services have become concentrated in the field of immigrant detention. The Immigrant Detention Center, where he is held, where Mahmoud Kali is held, is located in the same town to which I referred, the town of Jena, Louisiana, and it is privately operated by the GEO Group. Now, the GEO Group was founded in 1984 as a division of the Wackenhut Corporation, one of the world's largest private prison corporations at that time. Now, GEO Group has that status. And Wackenhut was the target of protests by young opponents of what we then called the prison, what we continue to call the prison industrial complex. So this story continues. In 2013, after GEO Group promised to donate $6 million to Florida Atlantic University, the Board of Trustees voted to rename the stadium after the corporation. However, after it was revealed that the GEO Group was involved in numerous lawsuits alleging human rights violations, including sexual abuse of people detained in their facilities, protests erupted locally, and solidarity actions occurred elsewhere in the country. Student protesters, some early abolitionists who recognized that we were not simply saying no to prisons, and that we wanted to do something very different from tearing down the sites of imprisonment, the actual buildings. We were especially concerned about the consolidation of relationships linking corporations, the criminal legal system, the realm of politics. In short, what Mike Davis had called, in relation to the changing landscape of California's agricultural economy, a prison industrial complex. And those relationships were what we were especially targeting. In other words, we didn't want simply to get rid of the actual prisons, the concrete structures with the foreboding razor wire, leaving the racist and repressive character of punishment intact, and leaving intact the exploitative character of capitalist exploitation. This was the beginning of an analytical framework that would help to shape more recent activist and scholarly discourses on abolition. And then, of course, there were also the students who simply did not want their school stadium to bear the name of a notorious private prison corporation. So eventually, the GEO Group was forced to withdraw its offer to donate $6 million to Florida Atlantic University, and it was forced to forego, of course, its naming privileges. Student protesters prevailed. Gina, lynching, prisons for profit, racism, protests, genocide. These apparent coincidences that I've sort of haphazardly evoked reveal important underlying historical relationships whose recognition led emergent abolitionists to initiate an important process of publicly challenging the ever-increasing impact of carcerality on important institutions, especially education in the United States. This is the beginning of an attempt to recall the history surrounding the location where the now most recognizable participant in the student protest against the Gaza genocide at Columbia University is currently incarcerated. Students have stood up and fought back. My name is Mahmoud Khalil, and I am a political prisoner. I am writing to you from a detention facility in Louisiana, where I wake to cold mornings and spend long days bearing witness to the quiet injustices underway against a great many people precluded from the protection of the law. Who, he continues, who has the right to have rights? It is certainly not the humans crowded into cells here. It isn't the Senegalese man I met who has been deprived of his liberty for a year, his legal situation in limbo, and his family an ocean away. It isn't the 21-year-old detainee I met who stepped foot in the country at age 9 only to be deported without so much as a hearing. Justice escapes the contours of this nation's immigration facilities. I am certain that Khalil's capacity to detect injustice was greatly honed by his time at Columbia. And there are stories about abolition to be narrated here, about the many linkages of issues and adversaries and protesters. Students have played central roles in unveiling and challenging the relationship between prisons, corporations, politics, and universities, and are the key figures in welcoming movements, along with popular and scholarly discourses on prison, immigrant detention, and police abolition. The moral of this story: if you stand with the students, you have a pretty good chance of being on the right side of history. Now, I'm not saying stand with any student or every student. I'm talking about the student movements that have unfolded here and abroad over the last decades and centuries. Those students are much more likely to stand for justice, equality, and freedom than otherwise. Those students who choose to develop their capacities to detect and stand up against injustice have said no to the regimes of white supremacy in the South. They joined the free speech movement at UC Berkeley. They registered people to vote. They gave their lives in struggle, and a number of them lost their lives. And I'm thinking right now specifically of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, and many others. University students learn what it means to learn and to learn how to think and to learn how to think critically, to learn how to question, to learn what militates against the expansion of freedom in our worlds, to learn that freedom is always collective, that freedom is worth nothing if it is not used to expand the reach of freedom for others. This history of students learning how to raise questions even about that which is teaching them how to question the world, has led to new fields of study. Black studies, Latinx studies, Asian and Asian American studies, indigenous studies, feminist studies, queer studies, abolition, feminism studies, cultural studies, environmental studies, critical prison studies, and I could continue. I don't have time to name, all of the interdisciplinary programs that have emerged since 1968, when students at San Francisco State University rallied for the first such program that would bring together departments of Black studies, Rasa studies, American Indian studies, Asian American studies, to call the names that these programs bore at their foundation, to bring them together in a school of third world studies. They declared that they would go on strike until the beginnings of these new institutions were guaranteed. And although the School of Third World Studies became the School of, and then College of, Ethnic Studies, which now includes resistance studies, as a way of guaranteeing the inclusion of Palestine studies, which, as I understand it, has not been able to exist under its own name. The 1968 strike at San Francisco State, it was then called San Francisco State College, initiated myriad changes in universities throughout the country, but especially those new interdisciplinary programs that would bring academically trained professors together with organic intellectuals to develop new modes of inquiry and knowledge production. San Francisco State was occupied by police for over a year. Critical prison studies, or contemporary abolition studies, or however you might choose to refer to this emergent interdisciplinary field, is closely related to feminist studies. And some of us often use the term abolition feminism. And I think I'm correct when I say that Avery Gordon was the first to introduce this term. Not so much to bring two fields or two movements together, but rather to acknowledge their interconnectedness all along, their mutual co-constitutive relationships, particularly with respect to the practices of anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism, of Black feminism, and especially to publicly recognize the decisive role feminist ideas and methodologies played in the emergence of abolitionist organizing and theorizing. Now, I'm going to pick up this thread a little later on, but I do want to point out now that just as many of us who were eager and sometimes even uncritical participants in radical Black liberation movements during the era that witnessed the occupation of Alcatraz, campaigns to free the Puerto Rican nationalists, campaigns to free Nelson Mandela, the Folsom Uprising, the Attica Rebellion, and I could name many other moments during that period. We recognize the important role of figures who sometimes represented masculinist approaches, from which we later had to work hard to extricate ourselves. And let me say, I'm not positioning women and men as binary adversaries here. Women sometimes assume masculinist positions, and those who identified as men often feminist positions. Of course, we hadn't learned anything about questioning the gender binary. So especially those of you who have grown up taking for granted that one always criticizes the gender binary, you should remember that this is a historical development. There was a time when it didn't occur. Even, those of us who considered ourselves progressive and radical, the ideas were not available. The discourses were not out there to, help us achieve a kind of understanding of the ideological character of gender. And I promised myself that I wouldn't stray away from my notes because I have a particular amount of time, but we'll see. Maybe I can speed it up a little bit. So I wanted to say a few words about the rise of radical Black liberation movements and the emergence of prison intellectuals, of whom George Jackson was perhaps the most celebrated, and these prison intellectuals early on helped to remove these institutions called prisons from the shadows to which they had been relegated, and from which they played their prominent roles of serving as the constitutive negation of, and thus also evidence of, the existence of liberal democracy. And those of you, if you're having trouble, following some of the terms, you can look them up. So look up constitutive negation, okay? And liberal democracy, that I don't have to explain, do I? Mm-hmm. But perhaps if we had time, we could talk about the conception of freedom that is attached to liberal democracy, which conceives of freedom as consisting fundamentally of individual rights. Now, I know, some of you will say, well, of course, we all want individual rights, don't we? But here I am again, straying from my notes. But I just want you to, question the degree to which these notions compel us to assume that the basic unit of society is the individual and not the community. None of us would be who we are if we did not live and work and think and protest in community. So, during the early 1970s, when vast numbers of people associated with radical movements were incarcerated, including the person who is standing up here right now talking to you. When vast numbers of people were incarcerated, prison intellectuals were arguing that the many calls for the freedom of political prisoners, and let's keep in mind Mahmoud Khalil's declaration that he is a political prisoner, that the many calls for the freedom of political prisoners sometimes failed to recognize the extent to which the vast majority of people inside of those institutions were subject to political imprisonment, given the extent to which the prison was, as we might phrase it today, especially in the aftermath of the mobilizations of the summer of 2020, that prisons are the most dramatic instance of structural racism. Now, that was also the message of the 1971 Attica uprising. And looking back at conversations unfolding during that period, I realize now that whether we were organic prison intellectuals, radical activists, concerned journalists, or university-educated scholar activists, many of us were striving to understand within and beyond our respective disciplines and fields, academic fields or more broadly, that we were striving to understand how and why the prison had become such a central constituent of the relatively short history of the United States, specifically the United States. And you can ask Professor Caleb Smith to explain that history and the impact on the imagination, which we're speaking about now. And why it was such a major feature of the apparatus that positioned Black people as preemptively under the control and management of social structures that were crucial to the production and reproduction of racism. So we've been talking a lot about structural racism over the last period. Am I right? I think that we were trying to understand what that might mean. Also, from the beginning, this work, this activist work, this scholarly work, reflected efforts to redefine feminism in ways that were trying to undo the presumption of whiteness within feminist scholarship at the time, and to undo assumptions of maleness in Black studies. And I have to admit that I have some personal stake in this. In the latter 1970s, I was teaching both women's studies and Black studies at San Francisco State University. So it would be several decades before what is referred to as critical prison studies, that is to say, interdisciplinary engagements with questions that trouble the assumed permanence of carceral approaches to social problems that might be better addressed through a more holistic or integrative approach. The question is not so much how to get rid of discrete carceral institutions, but rather how to strive for and organize toward the creation of a society that no longer requires the existence of racist and repressive institutions of punishment. And abolition feminism insisted on these scholarly and activist traditions. One of the early efforts to break free of an approach that assumed the necessity of incarceration occurred within the discipline of criminology at the Berkeley School of Criminology. There is a book that one of the faculty members of the school, it was called the School of Radical Criminology, at Berkeley, of course. So Herman Schwendiger and his wife, Julia Schwendiger, were on the faculty there. And they wrote a book, which is an account of the work of the school and about the political attacks on the school that led to its demise. And if any of you are interested, I think you can find it, a PDF online. It's called Who Killed the Berkeley School? And as the Schwendiger account emphasizes, the radical criminologists were not only bringing contestations into the discipline, they were actively involved in the movements of the 60s and the 70s. Julia Schwendiger, for example, was one of the founders of Bay Area Women Against Rape. And virtually all of the faculty and grad students supported the free speech movement that unfolded on the campus. Tony Platt is one of the affiliates of the school. He got his PhD there, and he also taught there, and he's still on the campus at Berkeley. The school no longer exists, but he's affiliated with the law school. He helped to write a very interesting analysis of the police, and I believe it must have been in 1970, I don't know, maybe 1975. I apologize, I don't have the date at hand. But it was an analysis of the police called Iron Fists and Velvet Glove. And I could talk a little bit more about how criminology came to be the home of many of those who were breaking with the theories and methodologies of criminology. But I just want to mention that other disciplines and fields, more recently, I'm jumping back and forth, and I'm talking now about geography, for example. Many of you know Ruth Wilson Gilmore and her Golden Gulag and her book Abolition, Geography. Her scholarship, of course, has always been paralleled by her activism, and interestingly has helped to emphasize possibilities of exploring political economy, or to reflect Marx's own practices. Siri is listening to me. Go away. All right. Now, I don't know whether you say it left. Anyway, I was going to indicate that Marx's own practices were not that of simply writing within the framework of political economy, but it was always critique. And that critique emanated in large part from philosophy. So I should say the critique of political economy. And then if we can move on, there's an interesting set of books edited by Alyssa Biera and others, and and it's called Abolition, Feminism, Volume 1 and 2. Alyssa Vieira is a philosopher, but she always also works within an interdisciplinary framework. And speaking of philosophy, and I'm not just going to continue to do free association here, but it just occurred to me that Tommy Shelby has a book that's called The Idea of Abolition, and it's in philosophy. And even if its attempt to refute some of the underlying assumptions of abolition, I would take issue with, but it has certainly introduced the discourse to audiences within and beyond philosophy. So I haven't mentioned such disciplines as history and sociology and literature because this is where the literatures are concentrated. I can remember initially we've depended largely on texts that emanated from history and from sociology and literature. I'm thinking about Bruce Franklin, for example, whose pioneering work on prison literature helped to shape the interdisciplinary field of what we're now calling critical prison studies. And I think I'm correct when I say that Bruce, who unfortunately passed on a couple of years ago, that he attended the Critical Resistance Conference in September of 1998. Are any of you familiar with critical resistance? Well, it was a landmark gathering of people who were interested in mounting a challenge to the ever-growing network of carceral institutions in California, but all over the country, and then also in other parts of the world. But let me back up for a second and say that it was perhaps to be expected that the roots of a new approach to prisons and police would begin to develop, as I was saying before, within the very discipline that was charged with justifying the central presence of prisons and police in our society. But also that meant that it might be extremely difficult to extricate radical analyses from the foundational theories and methodologies that grounded criminology. And just, one more comment before I resume. Interestingly, some of you are probably familiar with the Frankfurt School. Which, from the vantage point of our conversation now, can be considered one of the major engagements with interdisciplinarity during a period even before the academic disciplines had been consolidated to the extent that they are today. And also, there was a different notion of the humanities, the human sciences, so that a discipline like sociology would be considered the human sciences. And I'm saying this just to, trouble the assumption that we always have to think about humanities in the way that we think about humanities today. Some of the critical, there were critical criminologists. I think I mentioned the radical criminologists, right? But I didn't mention yet the critical criminologists. And I'll say a few words about them, but they were responsible for revisiting a text that was deeply influenced by Marx's approaches. The text was by Georg Rusche and Otto Kirchheimer, and it was entitled Punishment and Social Structure. And this text was associated with the Frankfurt School. Many of you probably know Horkheimer and Adorno and Marcuse, but I don't know if you've heard of Rusche and Kirchheimer. But let me say that, we were talking about critical criminologists, radical criminologists, and I just lost my place. And then, simultaneously, we had the development of what we might now call anti-racist scholarship and activism that began to address prison abolition. So critical criminology had already challenged the influence of positivism on the discipline. And during the 1970s and 80s in North America, critical criminologists, who were to be distinguished from the radical criminologists, like Harold Popensky and others, were deeply involved in debates on prison abolition. And a number of them attended the biennial conference sessions of an organization that was called initially International Conference on Prison Abolition. And later, they changed prison abolition to penal abolition because they were interested in a broader definition of abolition. So Harold Popensky published in the journal that ICOPA, International Conference on Prison Abolition, and engaged in scholarly debates with abolitionist criminologists in the Netherlands and in Scandinavia. And you can probably understand why there were probably proportionately more scholars interested in abolition in the Scandinavian countries. I'll just mention a few names. René van Schwanigen, Luc Holzmann, Niels Christie, who's from Norway. And then, of course, also the late Norwegian legal scholar whose work continues to be read today is Thomas Mathisen. He wrote a book called The Politics of Abolition. And if you've heard people talking about non-reformist reforms, and Mathisen uses that terminology in his examination of prisons in Scandinavia, not only Norway, but he also looks at Sweden. Now, I want to include the names of, I think I've just reached my time, so I want to include the names of two women who played major roles in the emergence and development of prison abolition discourses at the intersection of scholarship and activism. And they were both Quakers. There was Ruth Morris, who was from Toronto, and she worked with Canadian Friends Service Committee. She was one of the many Quakers. Yeah, I probably should have said this before. You have a disproportionate number of Quakers involved in abolition. And can you imagine why? Because the Quakers were the one who introduced the notion of the prison as punishment in the first place. And they thought, in their original conception, that the prison would be a wonderful place, for people to reflect on the wrongs that they had done and to emerge as new human beings from that experience. I mean, the problem was the penitentiary at that time was all about solitary confinement, and as Dickens and many other people said, that people, suffered terrible mental disorders as a result of being placed under. So the Quakers have felt historically a special relationship to this institution and a need to challenge it. Morris was one of the proponents of abolition among Canadian Quakers who were responsible for the very first major statement endorsing prison abolition. And in 1981, this committee, which was the Quaker Committee on Jails and Justice, became the first religious body in the world to publicly endorse prison abolition, declaring the prison system is both a cause and a result of violence and social injustice. Throughout history, the majority of prisoners have been the powerless and the oppressed. We are increasingly clear that the imprisonment of human beings, like their enslavement, is inherently immoral and is as destructive to the cagers as to the caged. Morris was also a founder of ICOPA, the International Conference on Penal Abolition, which began in Toronto in 1983 and has been held every 2 years in countries from Canada, New Zealand, Nigeria. The second woman I want to mention is Faye Honey Knapp. And she was also a Quaker. She was the founder of a Quaker prison ministry. And I mentioned her for a number of reasons. First of all, she was the driving force of a great deal of radical prison work that emerged in the aftermath of Attica. Knapp is the leading author of a text that some of you may have seen called Instead of Prisons, a prison abolitionist handbook, which was originally published in the 1970s and republished for use in relation to the organizing projects of critical resistance in the early 2000s, which is a period during which critical resistance emerged as a leading example of abolitionist organizing. So before I conclude, I do want to acknowledge the extent to which many generations of critical resistance have given leadership to developing abolitionist movements around the country, and has helped to stimulate and support international expressions of abolition. There is, however, an offshoot of the larger critical resistance campaign that perhaps bears a more direct relationship to the issues around academic study that we have been discussing today. Some of you may be aware of the fact that there was a huge critical resistance conference in 1998. The one we were initially hoping, and as we organized this conference, we were originally hoping that we would attract at least 300 people. And more than 3,000 people showed up from all over the country. So that was a moment that when we realized that we had done what the times were calling for. We didn't know it until they all came. I could have devoted my entire lecture to the phenomenal experiences that we had during the almost 2-year period of preparing for this conference, and the ways in which we encouraged what you might call interdisciplinary dialogue. When I say interdisciplinary dialogue, I mean beyond the very notion of academic disciplines and fields. There were 200 panels, and every person on the panel was urged to to think deeply about what it might mean to communicate to others beyond the disciplinary borders or the, I don't know, maybe I haven't done that well in doing that today, because I was, looking at a group of young people when I used the term, and they said, "What?" But it was fascinating because there were no panels that consisted entirely of academics, and no panels that consisted entirely of activists, because we know activists have a specialized language as well. And those of you who are activists, when you talk to people who haven't had that experience, sometimes they have no idea what you're talking about. So we ask people to think seriously and to stretch as much as they could in terms of creating the kinds of vocabularies that were both accessible and that did not deny the underlying complexity they were attempting to suggest. We even had, we tried to have people who had the experience of incarceration, or people who were actually in prison, on every single panel. And so you're probably asking, well, how did you get people in prison to come to the conference? They weren't allowed, well, this is California, so they weren't allowed to attend the conference, but they are allowed to collect phone calls. So we set up special telephones in the meeting rooms so that people could call from various prisons and make presentations on the panel. And you have to remember that the technology was, very primary, I would say. It was, we were trying to figure out how to use phone calls, I don't live on the internet. I try to use it, but I haven't internalized it, and I still find social media somewhat bizarre. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I do go and look sometimes, and I noticed on the internet that Ruth Wilson Gilmore and I co-founded Critical Resistance. I don't know if anybody else has checked that out. And technically that might be correct, but we were only 2 of more than 20 members of the organizing committee, which was remarkable. It was a collective undertaking of people who were community activists, university professors, students, physicians, and every single member of the organizing committee, and those who came in at various moments to assist with the work and whose names didn't necessarily appear in the official literature, made an essential contribution. We recently held a 25-year reunion and reflected on our work then and its continuing legacies, and expressed our collective amazement at what has happened over the last quarter century. However, I am about to conclude, but I do want to refer to a University of California Humanities Research Institute research group that was also convened under the name of Critical Resistance, beyond the prison industrial complex. So this was in the year 2000 at the University of California, Irvine. It was a quarter-long residency, which included intensive reading, discussions several times a week, guest presenters. I mean, we got to be students again, which was great. And those of you who are students, don't underestimate what you're doing here at this time and what this period is going to mean for you. But we also had discussions several times a week, guest presenters, and we had road trips all over the state of California to visit prisons. It was a small research group that included Nancy Shepherd Hughes, some of you may know her work, Avery Gordon, David Theo Goldberg, who after that became the director of the entire Humanities Research Institute for many years, Ruthie Gilmore, and Gina Dent, who's sitting on the front row there, and myself. So I pointed to her because I want to conclude by mentioning one of the more recent outcomes of that research group, and that is the ongoing Visualizing Abolition project at UC Santa Cruz, led by Gina Dent, and consisting of art exhibitions, residencies, academic programs, fellowships, artist residencies, and community partners. The portion of the project that unfolded online, incidentally, during 2020, the 2021 is still available, and it includes the phenomenal music and videos curated by jazz drummer Terry Lynn Carrington, who was in charge of the Music for Abolition. So you can still access that now. Yeah, I love the internet. And like art for abolition, music for abolition lives on. And this is where I conclude today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Davis, for that wonderful lecture. Due to time, we will postpone the questions to tomorrow. Professor Davis has told us that the lecture tomorrow will be shorter to give us more time for conversation. Yeah, much shorter, she said, much shorter. So tomorrow we'll have to, so please, an incentive to come back tomorrow, same time, at 4:30.